So, good evening, welcome. This is an episode in our series of programs called Northern Exchange, Contemporary Conversations on the Nordic Region. I'm Sally Yurkovich. I oversee all of the fellowships and grants programs for the American Scandinavian Foundation, and I'm especially pleased to be here tonight to introduce one of our ASF Fellows, Kelly McKowen, who is the author of Down and Out in Utopia, Unemployment as Moral Education in Norway, a book that will be coming out next summer. So Kelly is an assistant professor of anthropology at Southern Methodist University in Dallas, Texas, and actually is about to move to the College of William and Mary in Williamsburg. So he will be leaving Dallas and going to Virginia next year. And then he is joined by Ellen Cushing, who is a staff writer at The Atlantic. Ellen is widely published. In The Atlantic, she's written articles like about things like Sweet Green, the salad chain, and science washing, which is how science speak has invaded fashion, beauty, and food industries, and also the latest Pantone color of the year. So you may wonder why she's here talking with Kelly. But a little-known fact is that Kelly and Ellen went to college together at Brown. And so this relationship dates back about 20 years. And they worked together at Brown on one of the weekly publications. So Ellen was already a journalist. Kelly was sort of fishing around. Yeah. But he became an anthropologist and an ethnographer, and that's, to me, I'm also an anthropologist, very close to journalism in some respects. Anyway, Down and Out in Utopia is an ethnographic study that was actually part of Kelly's fellowship work under our sponsorship. And we hear a lot about social welfare in social welfare systems in the Nordic countries, but we don't often hear about the differences among the countries, and really then how the systems play out in everyday life. So tonight we're going to hear about Kelly's book, which is based on the everyday experience of unemployment in Norway. Take it away. We'll have about 40 minutes of conversation, and then we'll open the floor for discussion.
Thank you, Sally.
Hi, Kelly.
Hey, Ellen. How's it going?
Kind of loud.
Yeah. Everyone can hear us okay? Okay, great.
All right. So, Kelly, this book is based on 16 months of research in Oslo. I'm going to start with a fairly big picture question, which is, you touch on this idea in the introduction to your book and throughout the book, but you talk a lot about the global fascination with understanding and replicating the Nordic model, and you sort of talk about how, from Davos to DC, from the 18th century to today, there are all these enduring myths about these governments and these people, and so I'm wondering what these myths are and why they persist. Maybe a more normal way of asking this question is why is everyone so obsessed with Norway?
Yeah, including our president, right?
Yeah.
So, I'll start off by saying that I was one of these people that very much kind of bought into a mythology about Scandinavia, or at least I was really fascinated. This project, actually, if I was looking for its origins, I'd probably go back to when we were in college. And I took a course where I learned about different welfare systems. And I remember reading about Sweden and asking this professor, well, what is everyday life actually like for people there? And he told me, correctly or incorrectly, that there was no good English language account on that. And so I thought, maybe I'll try and go write that someday. And would Sally say 20 years later? It hurts me to say that. That sounds pretty a long time ago. I've tried to write something like that. So where does this mythology come from? You referenced the 18th century, which I read about very briefly in the book, and I'm talking about Mary Wollstonecraft there, the mother of Mary Shelley, the great feminist, that goes to Scandinavia in the 1790s and is herself saying, I wish that I could go to the interior of Norway to see these peasants that are virtuous, that don't lie. If anyone lies among them, they're ejected from the community, they're egalitarian. And where that's coming from is industrialization kind of the rise of modern capitalism in the United Kingdom, this idea there must be an elsewhere or an otherwise that's functional and virtuous. And so there's a through line with that into the present. In the 1930s, we have the Great Depression. We have Marquis Childs, the American journalist that goes to Sweden and writes Sweden the Middle Way. And it's the same kind of fantasy that somewhere in this world that kind of looks like the world that we come from, there's a functional alternative. There's a place where things work out. During the financial crisis, we have the economists calling the Nordic countries the next supermodel. And so I think the mythos, as much as it's about the Nordic countries, it's obviously about the people from around the world writing about the Nordic countries and about themselves and the kinds of contradictions they're grappling with in their societies. Somewhere people must have figured it out. Somewhere people must be living well and meaningfully. Why are people obsessed with Norway? I mean, why did I pick Norway as opposed to Sweden? Like I said, I started with the Swedish welfare state. I used to joke that it combines something that many Americans are kind of afraid of, which is like equality and egalitarianism, with something they love, which is money. It's a very prosperous egalitarian society. I mean, I say in the book that it might be the greatest experiment in the combination of wealth and equality at scale in the history of humanity. So I think that we're attracted and maybe repelled because of things that it has that we're interested in, and maybe some things that we're a little bit scared of.
So your book, of course, is about the welfare state. It's specifically a lot about unemployment. I'm wondering if you could just kind of talk us through, on a pretty basic level, the difference between the different welfare regimes you touch on, and then like, what's it like to be unemployed in Norway? Like, what's the experience?
Yeah, so, I use this concept that I didn't come up with in the book of welfare regime, which is coming out of, social scientific literature. We talk about welfare states, right? This country has a welfare state, this country has a welfare state, this one's more generous than this one. Welfare regimes, this is a concept that kind of decenters the state and reminds us that the state is not the ultimate guarantor of individual well-being in every society. I think you can make the case that there's a real welfare state in a place like Norway, but maybe not in the United States. And so there's an original typology of welfare regimes that a Danish social scientist came up with. There's the liberal welfare regime, there's the conservative welfare regime, and there's the social democratic welfare regime. The liberal welfare regime the premise of that is that markets are by and large good for society. Market participation is good for individuals. The commodification of labor power, selling your labor power for a wage is good for society and for the individual. And then it's in fact state intervention that introduces all kinds of economic and moral problems. And so if that's your premise, the welfare regime you get has a relatively limited role for the state. The individual is very much dependent on working, selling their labor power. In the United States, for example, many of us have health insurance through our employer. There's a larger role for private charity. If there are, welfare programs offered by the state, they're supposed to be uncomfortable and relatively unattractive. You should always obviously choose to work rather than use the welfare system. The conservative alternative, which we've had in like continental Europe, has this premise that the rise of market society was actually, it's kind of a mixed bag, and in many ways a negative thing because it disrupted traditional hierarchies. And so the welfare regimes of countries like Germany and France have really worked to maintain the role of, in the past, the single earner patriarchal family. Let's maintain the order that we're familiar with through the intervention of the state. But it won't be this direct intervention from state to individual. We'll protect the family, we'll work through intermediary institutions. And then in Scandinavia, you get a social democratic alternative where the rise of market society is, by and large critiqued by folks on the left, by the trade unions, by the Social Democratic Party, that point out that yes, there are benefits, there's growth associated with it, but it's a raw deal for working people. And so if we're going to get the benefits from this particular economic system, but mitigate all the kind of negative things that it does, we need an active role. The state needs to play an active role. We need an extensive public sector. We need individualized benefits. We need universal provision. We need benefits and services that are going to be attractive to middle class and upper middle class people so that the entire population feels that the welfare system is for them, that they'll buy into to paying taxes. So what does that mean for the experience of unemployment? Briefly in the introduction, I kind of sketch the contours of maybe a typical, they're not really typical, but American experiences and Norwegian experiences. And I could go into details if people are curious about that in the Q&A. But what's striking to me is that when a person loses their job in Norway, it is obvious what they do. People in the book describe it as natural, as automatic. They go to the Central Welfare Agency, which is called NAV. You don't go to your family. You don't go to your religious community. You don't draw on personal savings because in all likelihood you don't have them.
You don't go to GoFundMe.
You don't go to GoFundMe. You don't go to Cash App. You don't start gambling. Maybe you do. There are exceptions. But you go to NAV. And people say, obviously, this cradle-to-grave welfare institution, and you initiate this material, and as I write in the book, moral relationship with the state that teaches people things about what it is to be a subject in this particular society. You aren't left to fend for yourself in the same way that many people are in the United States.
And what does NAV do? Is it different from, other countries, sort of, to the degree that other countries have similar institutions? Like, what's NAV like?
Yeah, that's a great question. One way to kind of think about what I do is I do the phenomenology of the Norwegian welfare system, like the phenomenology of NAV. What's it like to experience it? So we don't have an equivalent to NAV in the United States. NAV is NAV, the Norwegian Welfare and Labor Administration. It's created, with this reform in the late 2000s, early 2010s, with this goal to basically take all of these different benefit schemes and social services and put them behind a single door. That was the idea, is that from cradle to grave, if you need something from the Norwegian welfare system, you'd go to one place. And they put that door in every municipality. So when I'm doing my research, NAV has something like 400 plus offices. It has a staff that's larger than Norway's standing army, which Norway probably now feels is like a problem. I think today it's something like 22,000 employees. It administers 1/3 of the state budget. So it's an enormous operation that, like I said, covers everything. Cradle to grave is misleading because your relationship with NAV almost starts in utero,
yeah,
and you can get funerary benefits at the very end. So it's this enormous, very complicated operation. And behind the single door is all kinds of, it's split in various ways. What's fascinating too is that when I was doing my research, I kind of caught the tail end of the physical door. There are still physical NAV offices all over Norway, but NAV mostly, this is what my new research is about, lives in your smartphone. It's not, you're accessing the single door when you're on the bus in your phone, and you're doing everything that previously you had to go into an office to do.
Right. I'm going to ask you about that later.
Yeah.
You had a line in the book that I love that was it's not a safety net, it's a trampoline. It really seems designed to not only kind of help people in the immediate, but actually help them long term and maybe get them to a better place than they were before. So, a lot of this book, the way you sort of did the research for this book is it's ethnographic. You talk to people, you spend a lot of time there. Can you talk a little bit about the value of an ethnographic approach for understanding an institution, a bureaucracy like this, over something else? Why spend all of this time sitting in people's living rooms talking to them about this when you could, crunch some numbers or something?
Yeah, I think that was the question that I had, when I was in that sociology class in college, which is, it's one thing to read these almost cartographic studies of a welfare system, to see them in organograms, to see them kind of laid out in charts. But my question was like I said, what does it feel like to get sick? What's it like to get sick? What's it like to have a child? What's it like to lose your job? All of these things that you can't necessarily understand without going and being there. So as Sally pointed out, I'm a cultural anthropologist. I teach ethnographic methods, field research methods, and I make the case every semester that I teach this that there are certain things that you can only see and understand if you were there. And of course, because they're college students, I say, have you ever been to a party where the next day someone asks you what was it like, and you say you had to be there, and they know exactly what I mean by that. That's what I'm trying to do in this book. What if we treated the welfare system not approaching it as if it were a map, but as if it were a city that we lived in and dwelled in, and created relationships in and aspired in, all of these things. And so the value of ethnography is bringing that to life for a reader. Maybe there are some Norwegians in this room. Maybe there are folks that have lived in Norway and know what I'm talking about firsthand. But I'm going to bet that most of you are not going to go to Norway and lose your jobs, right? And so what I'm endeavoring to do in 200 plus pages is give you the opportunity to walk around in some very different lives and learn what they learn, experience what they experience. I think you can only do that if you go and do it yourself. Now it's time consuming, right? You have to go learn the language and spend time with people, but I think it's worth it.
Yeah, you kind of dedicated your life to it.
Yeah, for better or worse, right?
Yeah. Is there anyone who you spent time with or, walked around with, either literally or metaphorically, who really stuck with you? Like, is there any kind of one person who you wish your readers knew and remembered?
I think, the people that get more airtime in the book are people that, for various reasons, stand out to me. So just off the top of my head, there's a 20-year-old kid who I call Kjetil, who's addicted to World of Warcraft. He graduates from high school and doesn't find a job, and so he's spending like 20 hours a day playing video games. So I know him while I'm also going to back office welfare meetings talking with bureaucrats about video game addiction among young kids. There's a guy who was born in Somalia but grows up in Norway and becomes a translator, and it's an extremely fulfilling career that also really helps him understand this double identity he has as Norwegian and Somali. And then as the number of Somali arrivals declines, he loses his job, and he's one of the kind of rare instances in the book where things really do go wrong. I mean, his family situation falls apart. There's a Portuguese engineer who in the book I call Martim, who is just so gung-ho for what he calls the Norwegian dream. When he's told in Portugal there's a job for life for him in Norway, he picks up and he's ready to go. And then he gets there and he's an engineer and he loses his job, but remains really optimistic and has really fascinating reflections on his perspective versus the perspectives of native-born Norwegians. I think one of the great things about anthropology and ethnography is this opportunity to treat people like what Norwegian anthropologist Mariana Gulasai once said. She called everyday life philosophers. That people have so much to share about their own experiences and what they're doing and what they believe. And so, yeah, a lot of memorable people.
Yeah, and you only get that stuff if you spend a lot of time with them. No one's going to reveal their life philosophy in a 20-minute interview behind a two-way mirror or something. So, the book is about the lessons that unemployment teaches people. Some of these lessons are kind of literal, and some of them are, as you say in the book, moral lessons. They the way your characters, subjects, what would you call them? Characters?
We call them interlocutors.
They're real people, yeah. The way these people interact with this system teaches them values. It teaches them, as you write, how to be good, how to live in accordance with the expectations and norms of one society. I'm basically asking you to summarize your whole book right now, but can you talk a little bit more about the moral education part of this?
So that's that's the thrust of this book. What makes it more than a travel log of an American going and subjecting himself to the welfare system for 16 months? And it's that I try to develop this argument, and I won't get into the scholarly literature because it's kind of boring, about the kind of didactic character of our everyday experiences, that hardship teaches us things, like I said, about ourselves, about our families, about the state, a trade union, a religious community. And so I make the argument that losing your job anywhere is a kind of moral education. But in different places, it teaches you different things because different things happen. So what do people learn in Norway? I should also say, why did I even take this approach? I had to make sense of kind of two phenomena in Norway that I observed very early. One was a very different perspective on big abstractions like the state, things like taxes and values like freedom. I'd have folks in Norway say, we love freedom more than you do, and then they talk about what freedom meant to them, and they meant something very different from what I think a lot of Americans did. So
what did they mean?
Freedom from hardship, the freedom to plan your future because you understand that you have security and stability, that you can actually imagine a horizon for yourself that's farther out than a couple weeks,
right?
Because you know that you'll be able to make ends meet. So this kind of way in which people had, they talk about, like I said, freedom, the state, and taxes, but have different values and meanings that they'd assign to these things. And I asked myself, where do these actually come from? The other thing I was really fascinated by and still I think at this point is maybe a little controversial among some of my audiences that I talk to in Norway, which is this widespread "when in Rome" mentality that I noticed among migrants. I remember one time another Portuguese engineer I was talking to. I was at one of these. I went to these job seeker courses for 6 months. When you lose your job, you can be sent to a job seeker course. And I was at this place for 6 months doing participant observation. And one day at lunch, I was chatting with some different folks from different parts of the world. And this one Portuguese engineer said, you have to understand, man, if we had this sick leave program in Portugal, we'd destroy it overnight. And I said, well, you're Portuguese and you're not destroying it. And he goes, yeah, but that's not what you do here in Norway. And the number of times I've encountered a similar mentality, I had to make sense of this.
Right.
And eventually, I was tracing it to people's experiences with the government, with NOV. A lot of people don't like NOV, but the fact that people could work and pay taxes and ultimately get things for those taxes and point to them concretely, I think showed me that they were learning things from their experiences. What do they actually learn? I think they learned that there's a value to work that is associated with the very successful redistributive community that they're part of. They learn that unemployment is not an individual problem, it's a social problem. Like, you losing your job in the United States might feel to you like it's a calamity for you, but I feel like in many ways, Norwegian society reminds you that you're losing a job is kind of a problem for everyone. People will talk about the welfare system as the bumblebee that somehow flies, and it flies because they have very high rates of employment. So you get 2 years of unemployment benefits. You can't spend 2 years eating, praying, and loving, right? You have to go out and find a job. So they learn things about the stability of the system. They learn things about belonging. Folks that are, about half my interlocutors there are 30 people that I focus on in the book. 14 of them were not born in Norway. And what many of them learn is that they are accepted and embraced and feel integrated until they lose their jobs. And so there's this interesting way in which being integrated into the labor market is tied up with sociocultural integration and belonging and being Norwegian. Just a couple things. Yeah.
Just a couple things. How do you think this moral you sort of started talking about this, but I'm curious about, what do you think this moral education looks like in, for example, the United States? What is the lesson that a person learns? And I know your book is not about the United States, but you do live here, and we're here. So, your book is sort of, one of the things I liked about it is that it's not too heavy-handed I liked many things about this book. This book rocks, by the way. One of the things I really liked about it was that it is not super heavy-handed. It's not a book where, you write a descriptive, ethnographic passage about something that happened in Norway, and then you're like, of course, in the United States, this would all be very different, but it's sort of lurking in the background unsaid. And I'm curious what you think, having come back, written this book, living here, what's the moral education of unemployment in this country?
Yeah, that's a fabulous question. I think that does really kind of haunt the book, right?
Right.
Inevitably. Well, I think obviously the experiences that people have when they're unemployed in the United States reflect their class status, the communities that they're part of, their background, their health status, all of these. There's so many factors. But in broad strokes, I think that unemployment in the United States reinforces for most people the sense that they are on their own, that it's shameful and inappropriate to ask for anything from society or from the state, that they should lean on their families, that they're responsible for saving, that it's moral or ethical to save money and plan for rainy days, that if you're unable to find a job, it's your fault. And so I think that this moral education turns a person inward to focus on their own faults and the ways in which they failed to live up to some sort of standard that's been inculcated in them or they're reminded of.
Right.
Yeah.
In the book you talk about how Norway has its own equivalent of the welfare queen, Navr. Is that how you say it?
Yeah.
Welfare member of royalty, gender neutral. What's the difference between that stereotype versus the American stereotype?
Yeah. No, I'm glad you brought that up because I don't want to create the false impression that there isn't shame associated with using the welfare system in Norway. So what is the Navr? So when I first went to do research for this project in 2014, I was meeting members of parliament, I was talking to journalists. People were telling me, oh wait, you're going to start meeting Navrs. We have this real Naving problem. And I asked, well, what's Naving? And noving is basically using nov with no actual plans to go out and work, just basically milking the system for all you can. So a nover is basically, it's Norway's welfare queen, as you've pointed out. And so I said, wow, this is like, do people know about this outside of Norway? Like, I'll find these people. And what I discovered very quickly is that it's very difficult to find real novers, people that are willfully misusing and abusing the system. And in fact, one journalist that I met with from Norway's largest newspaper was on the nov beat. And I said, do you know some novers that I could talk to? And she's like, I can't find them either, because everyone has a story. Like when you get down to it, the notion that there's someone that has just figured out all the ways they can get as much as they can from the welfare system, these people don't really exist in large numbers. And so the question I had is, well, why is there so much talk about noving then? Like I said, all the time I'm hearing, oh, we have a noving problem, you're gonna meet so many novers, I answered this question in the book by saying, well, I think that the discourse talking about noving is a way for people to communicate to one another what their own informal moral standards are for using this welfare system. By saying like, oh, I hate novers, and someone goes, oh, me too. Like, oh, all they do is take and they don't work. Yeah, that's the worst. It's kind of like they're kind of telling each other what the wrong behavior looks like and implicitly what the right behavior looks like. And I have these stories that I share in the book where people are like, oh, when I lost my job, I was going to go to Nov, and just going to be all these novers and then me. And then I got there, and they're like, oh, they're all just normal people like I am. One of the other small miracles, I think, of the Norwegian welfare system is that it does, put people in, people that are very different from one another in the same settings. In these job seeker courses I was in, you'd have folks from finance, you'd have architects that are in job seeker courses with former warehouse workers and would-be drag queens and folks that wanted to work in pharmacies or schools, really jumbling everyone together, if I'm optimistic about it, to kind of forge new bands of solidarity, to understand, look, we're going through the same kind of thing, we want the same kinds of things. So I think the noving myth even for them was pierced a little bit.
Your fieldwork was in 2016, right?
So for this book, 2014 to 2017, okay. Yeah.
That was a while ago. It was during kind of like the oil, like Norway's oil slump of the 2010s. It's 10 years later, basically. You went back recently. You write sort of toward the end of the book that you did some research on how Nov has adapted, as you were saying, to the smartphone era, essentially. Expensive, innovative, and unpredictable embrace of various technologies is what you were looking at. What did you find?
Yeah, that's a good question. First of all, I'll say something about the kind of time lag. I think that one of the things that distinguishes anthropology, culture anthropology, from journalism is, we think about timeliness in a different way and urgency. And I think that actually getting some distance from the material was very helpful for helping me understand what was anthropological about it. What do I learn about humanity by, with this data that I have from this particular period? And I'll say too, I remember when COVID, the pandemic happened, I remember thinking like, oh shit, like everything is different now. And then the pandemic ended, and now it's like somehow like the pandemic's been completely forgotten in Norway, and everything that I'm doing now feels relevant again. So what has changed? At the end of my time in 2017 for that project, I remember I used to just walk into welfare offices. I had great connections in Nov offices. I remember going to one office one day, and the doors were closed, and there was a sign up that says you need to make an appointment online. And I didn't really grasp at the time that this was initiating kind of a new understanding of what the single door into the welfare system was going to be. That it wasn't going to be people coming in physically, it was going to be them coming in through their smartphones. And since 2017, there's been a technological revolution in the Norwegian welfare system that I think is really, the consequences of which I think are poorly understood and probably underestimated. I like to use the word revolution because it really is, they're doing things that other societies are doing, but they're pouring billions of dollars into this, and they're taking encounters that are so familiar to social scientists, like the classic encounter between a person and a bureaucrat across a desk, and they're basically abolishing these. So as I was saying to Sally earlier, the welfare system now, it lives in your phone. It's you communicating your needs and your situation to an AI-driven chatbot. It's being a teenager unsure of what they want to do with their lives and being handed a VR headset to put on and puts you behind the wheel of a truck. It's AI-driven job matching. It's just this bonanza of new technologies and the remaking of these encounters. Like I said, with probably unintended consequences. I mean, one more thing I'll say, the Norwegian welfare state has always been municipal. It's always been local. You know, I think this is one of the things that many Americans don't understand about is in the past, when you were going to the welfare office, you weren't meeting a faceless bureaucrat. You were meeting somebody you went to high school with. You were meeting like your second cousin or something like that. And I think in addition to the sense that, you know, we're all, you know, citizens or we all live in the same place, there were few degrees of separation. There was a real sense of bondedness and a trust that was rooted in that local flavor to everything. And so, yes, it's more convenient to be able to use Nav on your smartphone, but I think it has serious consequences for trust, for communication, for how people understand their needs, all kinds of stuff. So that's what I went back. I went back for 7 months for a second book. Yeah, we'll see. We'll keep it going. Yeah.
I mean, it sounds like it's a lot less like pro-social. You know, like it seems like part of what I found sort of sweet about many of the things you described about Nav in this book are that like you said, you're sort of like interacting with people a lot. You know, there's a lot of classes and, you know, waiting for things among other people. And it sounds like now you're just kind of doing all of this alone, and it might make people feel more alone. It seems one of the things I liked about, or, you know, one of the things that sounded really nice about being unemployed in Norway is it seems kind of like cozy and friendly, and you sort of have a community and you don't feel alone in the way that you might in this country. And it seems like all of this tech might be rolling that back. But I'll wait for the next book.
Yeah. You know, I don't want to, like I said, I don't want to make it sound too positive. I mean, the title's ironic. I have to point this out. When I talked about the book in Norway, they're like, this is not a utopia. And I said, that's part of what the book is saying. And they're like, and we're not really down and out. And I'm like, that's also part of what the book is saying. But yeah, I think that these technologies, like I said, have profound consequences. And I think that they have, without any kind of democratic process, have centered or entrenched values that we think sound good, but maybe aren't. So I remember when I was in Oslo in 2024, I was spending quite a bit of time at Nav's headquarters in Oslo, talking to designers. They actually are employing a number of anthropologists to better understand the user's experience of the welfare system. And I talked to one, and she was talking about all the things that they're doing technologically to make the experience more convenient for users. And I asked, you know, would there ever be a reason to make the experience less convenient? You know, they're like, but we basically don't want people to ever have to think about anything they're doing. And I said, would it ever be good to slow things down and have people think? Like, could unemployment be an opportunity, for example, or getting sick or experiencing loss? Could these be opportunities to learn things about yourself or grow? Should everything always be about speed and convenience and the most rapid possible cycling of people back into the labor market? And she thought about it, and she goes, no, it should always be about convenience. So I think that sounds good. But I think we're unhappy with that speed and that superficiality in so many other areas of our life that when I hear them say, like, you know, people, like, they shop on Amazon, or, you know, they do everything online, they date online. Like, the welfare system should be like that too. And I want to be like, do people like that all the time? All the time, you know? And are these kinds of goods, are they different in kind?
Right.
You know. So.
How do you expect this book to be received in Norway?
In Norway,
or among Norwegians?
I don't want to presume. I mean, there might be Norwegians in this room. I hope there are.
Sure.
My experience so far, I've talked about the book at a number of universities, and the reception in Norway has been really wonderful. I mean, I have to really thank colleagues and friends and the audiences over there for such wonderfully generative and productive questions. The book has been shaped in many ways by these conversations, but I'm not under the impression that it's going to be. I gave a talk in Stockholm one time that afterwards my host said that felt a little bit like he's a scholar that works in Southeast Asia. He goes, it reminds me of the time I tried to give a talk to Singaporeans about Singaporeans to Singaporeans. He goes, I don't know if they loved it. No, in that particular talk, I had a Swedish professor say, well, I'm Scandinavian, and this doesn't sound anything like my experience. And I said, well, as a tenured Swedish professor? I don't know. I really welcome the conversation. I think it's really interesting, and I think that anthropologists have a responsibility to bring their work back to the people who have furnished them with so many insights. And so I look forward to kind of taking this on the road and talking to people about it and that kind of thing.
going on The View.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. We'll see.
I think this is my last question. I have no idea what time it is or how long we've been talking. So just cut me off if you need to. You went into this whole project with, or, you went into this, like young Kelly in college had a dream, a fairly simple idea of like, what, of Norway as a utopia. Like, how did writing this book and doing this work change your idea about that? Like, do you think that sort of the way non-Scandinavians like fetishize Scandinavia is a problem? Did working on this book sort of deepen or change your understanding of the mythos?
Yeah, of course. I mean, I think that, and this is something I've even grappled with folks that have read the book and given feedback, with my editor. It's funny, academics are kind of like, ooh, I like that you ultimately don't really tell us anything about anything, Whereas
you guys do love to do that.
Yeah, whereas like non-academics are like, tell us
Right.
in the end, should we like copy and paste this to the
Right.
United
Journalists
States?
are like, so what happened?
Yeah. And I come across as a skeptic in the book for obviously the kind of copy and paste thesis that we can just import these things, but not because I don't think that they'd work. I think it's learning Norwegian, living in Norway, spending time in welfare offices, spending time in job seeker courses, hanging out in parliament, following people's lives as they're making a living without a job. I think what it taught me is that these conversations that we have about policy, especially policy from elsewhere, are incredibly shallow. What are we doing when we try to when we create social and labor policy? We're creating context of experience. And the point of the book is that experience teaches us things. We can remake our hardships. And as we remake our hardships, we remake our experiences, we remake the kinds of people that we are. So I think my takeaway is that these conversations are far more philosophical than we realize. What does it do to my sense of the myth of Scandinavia? I'm of two minds about this. I kind of critique these books. The Year of Living Danishly.
Mm-hmm.
I've
not read that
I get
one.
it. I'm living my Danish year right now.
Exactly.
On the one hand, while feel free to bring more hygge into your life and that kind of thing.
Sure,
yeah,
I will.
More candles.
Yeah.
But at the same time, there's no utopia to copy. On the other hand, I'm I'm in the Oscar Wilde school of thought, where it's like political progress is basically this endeavor of constantly sailing towards new utopias, of kind of charting, fixing a horizon of aspiration in a future that could be otherwise and better, and actually trying to get there. And so I don't want to disabuse people of this notion that there's nothing to be learned from these societies. I think there's a ton to be learned. And I think that people should try to learn from these societies, if only, to basically, utopia is it's like the jaws of life. It's like, it keeps the imagination open when so much else in the world would seemingly try to close it and say that, there isn't a better future that's possible.
Right.
And so I think the book still tries to make the case that there are things to be learned, that there is a better future that's out there. Yeah. Great. We'll take some questions. Is that, yeah?
Yeah. Should we just, there's a mic.
Yeah.
Over here.
Thank you. This was fascinating. So I have two questions.
Yeah.
One, would it not necessarily work elsewhere just because of the scale and the size of the country versus coming over here to the U.S.? And then my second question is, I'm a little confused when you're talking about the immigrants and their experience, I think the Portuguese people, versus the locals losing their jobs and how they felt. Because if they're all getting, the benefits, I was just a little confused where you were going with that. So if you could elaborate on that more.
These are fantastic questions. Maybe I'll start with that second question first. So when I say that they have different experiences, yes, they're eligible for the same kinds of benefits. And I'll say just for folks that don't know, the basic unemployment benefit scheme, if you've earned $20,000 US the previous year, you're entitled to 62.4% of your salary for the next 2 years, up to a ceiling. So it's not like, I made $2 million last year, this is gonna be amazing. But it's one of the world's, if not the world's most generous unemployment benefit schemes, in addition to all the other kinds of support that you receive and things that you don't have to think about. When I say the experiences differ, they differ because of things like discrimination or racism, but also the reflections differ because a number of my migrant interlocutors have previous experiences to point to. They've been unemployed in other parts of the world. They've been employed in Chile or Spain or Italy, so they can directly kind of compare. They also reflect, they're like anthropologists, right? I remember I had a Serbian interlocutor, she'd done her PhD, was looking for a job in pharmaceutical research in Norway, and she reflected, as many people did, on what would be happening to them if she still lived in Serbia. If I still lived in China, if I still lived in Poland, for example, what would be happening to me? And she could see she said, I'm 30-something, I'd be on my parents' couch, I'd be asking my dad for money to go out and see a movie, it'd be wretched. And so that's kind of what I meant, that people, they have sources of comparison to draw on. And right, your first question?
Oh, about the scale.
About the scale. That is the right way to think about it. I think that one of the things that I encounter relatively regularly, I call this Norway splaining, where people come to me and they say, before I've even said anything, they said, this wouldn't work because everyone is white there. Everyone's, it's racially, ethnically homogeneous. And I say that's, first of all, that's not true. But second of all, if there's any kind of like secret sauce that makes a lot of this work, it has been scale. I'm not under the impression that if I did research in the United States that I could hang out with senators, that I could meet the president. I met the current prime minister, I met the former prime minister, I was in parliament regularly hanging out. Just because of the few degrees of separation that made that possible. I think that so much of that trust is just rooted in a sense of intimacy and participation in shared institutions. Could it not work here because of the scale of the United States? What aspect are we talking about? I think that one of the things that we have to understand, which I don't have time to kind of get into, is that the welfare system is part of it's part of this broader way of doing capitalism. These are it's a small export-driven economy, and the welfare system goes hand in hand with all these labor market programs designed to get people back into the labor market. Norway doesn't have infinity people. It's 5.5 million people. They need a skilled and flexible workforce. And I think for decades now, they've kind of agreed across the political parties that it's probably a bad idea if a firm collapses or a sector collapses for these people to just be left to wither. They should be retrained. They should be cycled back into the labor market. We'd have to value people like that. And there's other things. You need like more trade union density, strong, labor parties, those kinds of things. Yeah, great questions. Anywhere.
I have so many questions. I'm going to ask just one. Going back to the beginning of your talk, you were talking about different models of welfare states, and you mentioned Germany and perhaps one other European country as examples of conservative welfare programs. And I was a little bit confused by what you said because I had been under the impression that the start of the welfare system in Germany in the 19th century, as instituted by Bismarck for conservative purposes, had been in fact instigated by, promoted by, maybe even administered by the state. And you, however, said that the conservative model operated through intermediaries like family and smaller social groups. So I was confused.
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. So yes, you're right. So in the Esping-Andersen tradition of comparative welfare scholarship, Germany is held up as the great innovator in the 19th century, as Bismarck kind of steals the thunder from the socialists and social democrats, right? They're agitating for these reforms that will improve workers' lives, and he scoops them, right, with a series of programs that kind of births the modern welfare regime as we know it. It has a role for the state, but it's paternalistic, and then it's a relationship between the state and kind of traditional societal actors. So maybe in France, for example, where traditionally the Catholic Church was very strong, you have a state that's very much going to support the Catholic Church in continuing its charitable mission. By contrast, in Scandinavia, we're going to see a real hollowing out to the extent that it exists. The intermediary organizations will be hollowed out. This is going to be run by the public sector. Taxation will be individualized. Benefits and services will be individualized. And so the state directly is playing a very strong role in individuals' lives. So maybe that wasn't clear. But so yeah, in the continent, traditionally, a corporatist welfare state, a relationship between the state and religious communities, maybe trade unions, guilds or guild-like organization, those kinds of things. Yeah, fantastic.
Question is, right now in the United States, we have Minnesota area, the Somali migrant is taking advantage of all the welfare of the United States. They put like a fake number of the population and getting money for the childcare, or the old people driving back and forth and so forth. So how is it in Norway or any other Scandinavia country that when people violate the rule, making money out of government money?
Yeah, so is there welfare fraud? Absolutely, yeah. I mean, you've people convicted, like in the tens or hundreds of people. It's not that many people, but every year there's money that's reclaimed that was falsely paid out. There are people that have defrauded the system. I talked to people in the book that admit to kind of bending and maybe breaking the rules. That one of the Portuguese engineers, Martim, tells me about some of his Portuguese friends that are actively defrauding the welfare system by, they lost their jobs in Norway. They're receiving unemployment benefits, but they've moved, I think, to the Netherlands, and they're working full time and collecting. When NAV summons them for a meeting, they get on Ryanair and they go back. And so
It's a good scam.
Yeah, it's a good scam. He actually, it's funny. I quote him in the book. He says, "Don't reveal this scam," which he meant to the police. But my editor was like, "We can't publish this." He's saying, "Don't reveal it." So I had to find him and just be like, "You meant don't reveal this to the police?" He's like, "Yes, obviously, you can write about it."
Put it in a book forever.
Put it in a book forever. But yes, absolutely. I mean, there is welfare fraud on a very small scale. And if anything, what's gotten a lot more headlines in recent years are the misdeeds of the welfare system itself. So there was a huge scandal in 2019 where NAV had, people had been convicted of, I guess, welfare fraud. Money hadn't been paid out that was the people actually deserved. So I feel like NAV is oftentimes getting they're the ones that are getting the slap on the wrist. But yes, certainly, obviously, welfare fraud exists. Yeah.
Do we need a mic?
Oh, there we go.
I just a question about the economics of it, how it works, right? So I guess I understood from being there, it's not all the sovereign wealth fund, it's not the oil, it's funded through taxation.
Yeah.
But the taxation rate is like 20-25% average, so it's not huge. So is it just that there's no money that's being spent on other things that we're spending on here, that it fuels this? And also before the oil in Norway, which is I guess 1970, the discoveries, this same system existed, right?
Yeah.
So, but what makes it go economically? Is it there's also a wealth tax in Norway that we don't have, but that's not paying for this either, right?
Yeah, the wealth tax is not a significant contributor to annual budgets. That's a great question. And a lot of Americans are surprised to learn a couple of things about the Norwegian taxation system. So, for example, there's a flat tax at 22%, and then there are marginal rates that go up. What makes it unique is that the system in general is not so progressive, that the highest kind of tax brackets kick in at much lower incomes. And taxes on income are a significant contributor to annual budgets. So the way that I think about it, and I'm not a tax expert, but it's like, I think it's a quarter of, so if we think about the state budget, a quarter is coming from taxes on income. I think approximately a quarter is coming from taxes on corporations. A quarter is coming from VAT taxes, value-added taxes, and then a quarter approximately now is being funded out of the Sovereign Wealth Fund, and I guess taxes on the oil and gas industry. The Sovereign Wealth Fund, people probably know, it's like $2 trillion for a country of 5.5 million people, 5.5 million people. And they limit the spending to approximately 3% of the fund's value. And so that's not going up in any dramatic way, but obviously as that fund grows, what 3% is grows. And so there's been an effort to rein in spending. There are also people that say that more should be spent. So yeah, I think you can think about it approximately in quarters. So I think the notion that Norwegians are like taxed to death is wrong. And I think also, I mean, one of the points of the book, I mean, I teach at a relatively conservative university in Texas, Southern Methodist University, where oftentimes the first question I get is, isn't this a communist country? You know? And one of the things that I like to tell my students is I think that you could take the most conservative Texan and have them live in Norway for a year, and I think their mind would be changed about a lot of things because of their, like, you know, break your arm. Don't try to break your arm, but if you break your arm, go and use the healthcare system. And I think what you learn about that from that experience, I think will open your eyes to what your taxes can actually get for you. I think it would change people's minds. So yeah, that's my kind of take on the tax system. Obviously very dependent on oil and gas. That represents a huge issue moving forward. Like what will the future look like for the Norwegian economy and the Norwegian welfare system? But as long as it's an export-driven economy, I think they'll still maintain a relatively robust welfare system that keeps people secure and then tries to retrain them to cycle them back into some new field, AI of some kind. So, great question.
I think we had one more.
Hey, Greta, did you have a question?
Yes, I did. I wanted to know actually a couple of things. I wanted to know whether the ordinary public was polled on whether they wanted to have this NAF office system digitized and put on computer, or whether they wanted to have personal contact at the local offices, whether their preferences were taken into account. And the other question I had was that now that AI is under such discussion, it seems probable that in the future there honestly won't be enough work for everybody to be able to work because the AI can do a lot of jobs that people used to do. And what will they do when there really aren't any jobs to have that go around to all the people?
These are fabulous questions. If you ask that 20-year-old, you'll play World of Warcraft all day, you know? So, yes. Were people polled? Definitely not. I mean, I think that one of the things that was interesting to me is that, I mean, this gets into a broader conversation about Norway's status as like a world leader and pioneer and being on the cutting edge of everything. The OECD puts out a series of reports and papers on e-government, digital government, and the future of what government will look like. And the Norwegian government, I think, rises to the challenge and decides it's just going to, you know, put a lot of money into things that over time they think will make services more convenient, but also probably cheaper. It's cheaper to kind of eventually have all this technology in place rather than 22,000 people administering the system. So no, people weren't polled. I think the assumption is, like I said, people like online dating, they like online shopping, they'll love online welfare state. I think the results have been mixed. To the question about what will everyone do, I'm writing an article about this right now because, in anthropology, there have been this question's been asked: what comes next? Inevitably, universal basic income or some other way of doing things, a new productivist politics, a new politics of distribution must be on its way. People must understand this. And then you look to Norway, where you have a robust redistributive community, you have an enormous sovereign wealth fund, and if the future was going to, the post-productivist future was going to happen anywhere, it'd probably be Norway, right? But then you have, like in 2016, you have the European Social Survey that's done, and Norwegians are like close to the bottom with respect to support for universal basic income. They're among the highest with respect to commitment to employment, which is people saying that they would go to their jobs and work regardless of whether they would be paid for it. So we have a kind of puzzle. Why doesn't Norway tip into a kind of post-productivist future? Why don't they fantasize about a far shorter work week? And the kind of answer that I have, which isn't, I don't think, a particularly satisfying one in the paper, is that this system that they have, which centers production, currently works. It's impossible, it's very difficult to imagine a politics beyond it, because in this particular place, it's highly functional. You do have high employment rates. There are new industries coming into existence. It is possible to live something like the American dream, right? Where it's like you go to school, you get educated, you get a job, you're paid relatively well, you get 5 weeks of paid vacation every year. So you take your family to Crete, or Spain or something like that. You retire relatively young. All the good things are seemingly still possible in a society that's founded on formal wage labor. And so I think it's not yet kind of thinkable, but it's going to have to be thinkable because I think you're right. It's careening towards them. Great questions. Do we have time for one more? Or? Yeah.
Yes?
Sure.
To go back to one of your points again early in your talk, you talked about the myth of Scandinavian success, especially the myth of the third way. And in the course of your talk, I was not at all clear that whether you wanted to or had demolished that myth. I have the sense, in fact, that to the extent you addressed it implicitly, it is the third way,
Yeah.
and it's successful, and it may not be utopia because being unemployed is not pleasant, even there. But I did not sense that you had demolished that myth or wanted to, and yet you were pretty emphatic at the beginning about these continual myths. So I wondered whether you, in fact, had said anything about that in the course of your talk that I missed, or whether you could address that.
Yeah, I like this. This sounds like the kind of Amazon review I'll get, right? Like the kind of Amazon review that but that's yeah. No, but it's a great point. And I think that's kind of where the book ends. The book ends with, the book opens with me going to a dinner party with this collection of eminent scientists, social scientists that we're collaborating on this project about, does Norway represent a model for sustainable modernity? And I talk about my ambivalence about being part of this endeavor at the beginning. And then I end the book asking basically this question: what have I actually said about utopia? And I think I give an answer that's probably as unsatisfying as the one that I've given now, which is that, of course, these societies haven't figured out everything. If they've solved some of the problems that we're familiar with, they've generated their own. And yet, I close with this elderly man who I talk about earlier in the book, I call Oddvar, who has a cottage provided by the municipality. He lives on a pension from the government. He goes to a public senior center. Basically, his entire existence is kind of shored up by, we'll say, the state. And I actually first met him when I was just out of college. And I asked him this kind of stupid question. I said, how does it feel to be so dependent on government? And he goes, I'm not. I'm free. I'm free to all the people that matter to me. My entire life, my family has known me to be a free individual. And so, yeah, I have all this stuff from the government now, but I don't have to be, my kids don't have to take care of me. I have my own place to live. I have my own money. I have my own entertainment. That, to me, is freedom, and that's what I want. And I close the book by saying that, yes, that's not utopia, but it's something different, and I think something that's absolutely worth thinking about. So no, it's not a myth-busting book, and maybe I've misrepresented it in that way. It's trying to make the case that there are no cure-alls, there are no panaceas, but there's certainly a lot that's worth thinking with and thinking about in these places.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Kelly.
Yeah, thank you everyone for being
Thank
here,
you,
braving the
Scandinavia
cold.
House.
Yeah. Speaking of Norwegian experience, the bone-chilling cold. Thanks for being here.